Welcome to our deep dive into South African family law. We have all these fascinating academic texts you've shared with us, and they focus on, marriage, divorce, parental rights, all the legal stuff that comes with families in South Africa.
hmm
And, it's complex. It's really complex. And what's so interesting is how different it can be from, legal systems in other countries.
Oh, yeah, for sure. South African family law is really unique. It's this mix of traditions and cultures and social justice. So we'll be breaking that all down as we go.
Okay, so we should start at the very beginning, before I do even happens.
Before the wedding.
Yeah, we're talking engagements, and it's interesting that there's actually a whole legal side to that. The study guide talks about breach of promise, which just sounds so traumatic.
Yeah, it does sound pretty intense. And historically, breaking off an engagement was a big deal here. Like, legally, it could lead to, financial claims and stuff.
Oh, wow. Wait, so you could, sue someone for breaking up with you?
Yeah, basically the idea was that breaking an engagement causes actual financial losses, like wedding preparations or even like future income or inheritance if someone expected to gain that through the marriage.
Wow, that's a lot. So what's changed? The study guide mentions that the courts have kind of moved away from that.
They have. A big case actually went all the way to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and they shifted the way we think about engagements. Like the court said marriage is about personal commitment, not, a business transaction.
So heartbreak isn't like a legal matter anymore?
Yeah, not in the financial sense. You can still claim for like actual expenses for the broken engagement, like deposits for the venue or caterers, but courts won't award money for like potential future losses or anything.
Okay, so it's more about getting back what you spent, not like getting money for a broken heart.
Exactly. Now, getting past engagements when you actually tie the knot, South Africa recognizes a few different types of marriage, each with their own rules. The study guide starts with this because it's so important to understanding everything else.
Okay, so we have civil marriages. I'm guessing those are the most common.
Yeah, they are. Civil marriages are legally registered unions between two people and are governed by the Marriage Act, pretty similar to, Western countries.
Then there are customary marriages, which I find really fascinating. They're like rooted in South Africa's cultural history.
Yeah, and the study guide really emphasizes how important customary law is to our legal system. These customary marriages are recognized in the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act, and they have all these different traditions and practices that vary between groups.
One thing that always stands out to me is lobelo. Sometimes it's called the bride price.
It's really important to understand what lobelo means culturally. The study guide really makes that point. It's not about like buying a wife. It's more like a symbolic exchange of gifts between the two families. It shows the value the bride is bringing into the marriage.
So it's about connecting the families and showing the bride's worth. But does lobelo have any legal impacts? Like if the marriage ends?
That's a tough one. The courts have debated this, and the study guide actually talks about how tricky lobelo is in a modern legal context. So it's traditionally symbolic, but it can have financial implications if there's a divorce. Courts have done different things, sometimes considering lobelo when figuring out a fair settlement.
Wow. So it's not just culture, it ties into legal stuff too.
Right. Now, besides civil and customary marriages, South Africa is also figuring out the legal side of Muslim marriages. And this goes back to the history of family law here. The study guide talks about this too. So because of colonialism and apartheid, different legal systems existed for different groups based on race and religion. We're still working on a fully unified and inclusive system for everyone.
I see. So where do Muslim marriages stand legally right now?
It's complicated. The study guide says it's kind of in flux. They're not fully recognized legally yet, but there have been some developments in the courts to protect things like inheritance and maintenance.
So it's a work in progress, but it seems like there's movement towards giving Muslim couples more legal equality.
Yeah. And now, before we even get into what happens within a marriage, there's this wild concept that a marriage can be void or voidable, basically meaning it wasn't a real marriage from the start, or it can be annulled. The study guide has a whole chapter about what makes a marriage legally valid.
Wait, void? That sounds like a soap opera.
It does, right? Like, imagine someone marries someone who is already married. That's bigamy, and it makes that marriage void. Legally, it never happened.
Wow. So it's not just a messy situation, it's like seriously legally wrong. What about voidable marriages then?
So a voidable marriage is valid at first, but can be voided if a court says so. This happens if someone was underage when they got married, or if they were tricked or forced into it, or even if there was a mistake about the other person's identity.
So there are rules to protect people who didn't really consent or understand what marriage means?
Yeah. The study guide says the law really wants to make sure people freely choose to get married and understand what it means. Now, once you're married, The next big thing, and this is a big part of the study guide, is figuring out money as a couple. South Africa has 3 ways of dealing with money and property in a marriage, and it's important to understand them.
Okay, so let's hear it. We've got community of property, complete separation of property, and the accrual system. And the study guide makes it clear that choosing the right one matters, especially if things go wrong.
Absolutely. Let's start with community of property. That's the default in South Africa, unless you have a prenup that says otherwise. So basically, everything you and your spouse own, even stuff from before you got married, becomes part of a joint estate.
So you're putting all your assets together, for better or for worse.
Exactly. It shows your partners, sharing ownership. But the study guide also warns about the downsides. If one spouse is bad with money or has debt, the other spouse is responsible for it too.
So you need to trust each other and be on the same page financially. What about complete separation of property? Is that the opposite?
Pretty much. It's what it sounds like. Each person keeps their own stuff. What's yours is yours. What's mine is mine. During the marriage and if there's a divorce.
So you're financially independent. But the study guide mentions this could be unfair if one spouse contributes more to the house or makes sacrifices for the family.
That's true. Imagine one person stays home to raise the kids while the other works. If they split up, the stay-at-home spouse could be in a bad spot financially.
Okay, so that brings us to accrual. The study guide calls it a mix between sharing and independence.
Yeah, it is. Accrual starts with each person keeping their own assets, but when there's a divorce, the spouse whose estate grew less during the marriage can claim some of the growth from the other spouse's estate.
So even if you keep things separate, you're building a life together, and that matters if you split up.
Right. And no matter which system you choose, there are some legal things that apply to every marriage here. The study guide calls these invariable consequences.
Invariable consequences. So some things are not negotiable, no matter what you decide about finances.
Right. One big one is the duty of support. That means spouses have to support each other financially. It doesn't matter what their prenup says.
So even if you agree to keep finances totally separate, you still have to help if your spouse needs it.
Yes. That duty of support includes basic things like food, a place to live, and medical care. And it also means one spouse can sometimes be responsible for contracts for the house, even if they agreed to keep finances separate.
So you can't just say tough luck if your spouse is struggling, even if you have a prenup.
Right. The law says you have to support each other in a marriage. It goes beyond what's written in a contract. Another invariable consequence is about the matrimonial home. No matter who owns it or how you handle finances, there are special legal protections for it.
Interesting. What does that mean in real life?
So let's say one spouse has a lot of debt. Creditors can't just take the house to get their money back. Even if that spouse technically owns the house, the law makes sure the family has a place to live, even if there are money problems.
So it's about making sure the family has somewhere to live.
Exactly. Now, before we get into divorce, there's one more thing the study guide talks about that's important: the antenuptial contract, or a prenup.
Ah, the prenup. It always seems like something for rich people in the movies. Is that how it is here?
Not really. The study guide says prenups are actually helpful for any couple, no matter how much money they have, if they want to decide how to handle finances in their marriage.
So it's about being open about money and deciding things before you get married.
Yeah, exactly. With a prenup, you can choose which system you want for your money, even if it's not the default. And you can decide how to handle certain assets, like inheritances or family heirlooms.
So if I had a family heirloom, I could make sure it stays in my family, even if we're married in community of property.
Exactly. It gives you control and can prevent problems later, especially if there's a divorce. It's about being prepared and clear about your finances from the start.
So we've talked about all the different types of marriage and how couples handle money during a marriage. But what happens when things don't go as planned? Like the D word, divorce.
Yeah, it's definitely not ideal, but it's a big part of family law. Ending marriages, The study guide says South Africa has a no-fault divorce system.
No fault? So does that mean you don't have to, prove your spouse did something wrong?
Yeah, that's the idea. Sometimes marriages just end regardless of who's to blame. You just have to show that there's no chance of getting back together.
So if you've grown apart or just can't agree on things, the law says you can get a divorce without blaming each other. Seems more fair and less like a fight.
It is. It's more about finding a solution that works for both people. The study guide says to actually get a divorce, here you go to court and show the marriage is over. Usually that means proving you're living apart, not talking or just having differences you can't fix.
So once the court says the marriage is over, then what? Splitting up money and stuff must be hard, especially if things ended badly.
That's where choosing the right system for your money and property really matters. And the study guide makes a big deal about this. Things can be very different depending on whether you were married in community of property, separation of property, or accrual.
Right, so let's go over how each one works when you get a divorce. Community of property, so everything is just split 50-50, right?
Well, in theory, yeah, the joint estate is usually divided equally, but the study guide does point out some exceptions.
Oh, really? So even with community of property, it's not always a simple split.
Nope, the court can actually decide to split things differently if one spouse was reckless with money or wasted assets. The main thing is to be fair. The court can adjust things so one person isn't taken advantage of.
So the law tries to protect people from financial abuse. Okay, what about separation of property or accrual?
With separation, each person keeps their own stuff, just like during the marriage. Clean break. But there might be claims for maintenance where one spouse has to financially support the other, especially if there's a big difference in what they earn or if one person sacrificed their career for the family.
So even if you keep your assets separate, one person might need help after the divorce.
Right. Now, accrual is where it gets complicated. Remember, in accrual, you keep your own assets during the marriage, but when you divorce, the person whose estate grew less can claim part of the growth from the other spouse.
So you're sharing the gains you made during the marriage, even if you made them separately.
Exactly. And the study guide actually has a formula for calculating the accrual. It can be pretty tricky. You'd probably want a lawyer to make sure things are fair.
Sounds like it. Now let's talk more about maintenance. The study guide says it's really important, especially when one person is in a much worse financial situation after a divorce. How do courts decide if someone has to pay maintenance?
It's not a simple answer. Lots of things matter, and the study guide lists all of them, like how long the marriage was, how much money each person earns, their age and health, how much they contributed to the marriage, even how they behaved during the marriage.
So it's not just about who made more money, it's about the whole picture and who can support themselves after divorce.
Right. The court wants to make sure things are fair and no one suffers unnecessarily. Another big thing during divorce is what happens to the house, especially if there are kids involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. The study guide talks about different options for the house during divorce, like what usually happens.
Well, it depends who owns the house. What's their financial situation? Are there kids who need to stay in the house? One option is selling the house and splitting the money. Or one spouse could buy out the other one. Sometimes they might even keep owning the house together even after divorce, especially if it's best for the kids.
So there's no one right answer. It's about finding a way that works for everyone.
That's it. And the court always cares most about what's best for the kids. That's a big factor in deciding what to do with the house. Oh, and before we move on from divorce, there's this unique thing in South African law. It's called redistribution of assets. The study guide mentions it for couples married before certain dates.
Redistribution of assets, what is that?
So it's meant to fix some injustices that happened under the old legal system, especially for women married out of community of property before 1984 or 1988, depending on their race.
So it's about fixing past wrongs.
Yeah, basically. Back then, a lot of women, especially black women, couldn't own property even in their marriages. Redistribution of assets lets the court change how assets are split in a divorce, to recognize what the wife contributed even if she didn't legally own anything.
So even if they were married with complete separation of property, the court can make sure the wife isn't left with nothing because of old laws.
That's the point. It's a powerful tool to make things fair and acknowledge what each person brought to the marriage. Even if the law didn't recognize it at the time, the study guide actually has examples of how this has worked to make divorce settlements more fair.
That's really interesting. The law can change to fix old problems and make things more equal for families. Now let's talk about something else really important. Parental rights and responsibilities. The study guide has a whole chapter on this.
This is where the best interests of the child are the most important thing. Every decision about kids' custody contact, even medical treatment, has to be based on what's best for the child.
So it's not about what the parents want, it's about what's best for the child.
Exactly. Parents don't have unlimited rights. The study guide is very clear about that. Their rights depend on what's good for the child. The court has to protect kids and make sure their needs are met, even if it means limiting what the parents can do.
Okay, so let's break it down. The study guide talks about guardianship, care, and contact. What do those mean?
Okay, so guardianship is the legal responsibility for a child, making big decisions about their life, education, medical care, even religion. It's having the authority to decide those things.
So it's like the big picture decisions that shape the child's life.
Yeah. Now care is more about the day-to-day stuff, providing a home, food, clothes, emotional support, making sure the child has what they need to grow up well.
And contact.
Contact is the right of a parent who doesn't have the child most of the time to still see them and have a relationship with them. This could be visits, phone calls, even staying overnight. It depends on what's best for the child and what's possible.
So even if parents split up, they're not encouraged to be in the child's life unless there's a reason not to, like abuse or neglect.
Right. The study guide really stresses how important it is for kids to have both parents in their lives whenever possible. It's good for their development, but the court can limit or even stop contact if it's not safe for the child.
It sounds like it's about balancing the rights of the parents with the needs of the child. How do courts actually decide about custody, care, and contact?
Well, it depends on the situation. The study guide lists a lot of factors that the court considers: the child's age and development, their relationship with each parent, whether each parent can take care of them, what the child wants if they're old enough, and any dangers to the child.
So there's no set formula. Each family is different.
Right. The court tries to come up with a plan that's best for the child, even if the parents aren't together anymore. And what happens when parents can't agree on those things? That's when the family advocate steps in. The study guide talks about how important they are for protecting kids during family disputes. They work for the court and investigate what's going on. Then they recommend what they think is best for the child.
So they're like a neutral party who speaks for the child.
Exactly. They talk to the parents, the child, and anyone else involved, like teachers, therapists, social workers. Then they write a report for the court suggesting a plan.
It's good that there's someone to look out for the child when things are so emotional.
It is. The family advocate helps make sure the child's voice is heard, even if they're too young to explain when they need. We talked about customary marriages earlier. They have their own unique challenges.
Yeah, like law below and what that means if there's a divorce. What else is important to know about customary marriages legally?
One big difference is polygamy. A man can have more than one wife, but there are laws to protect the rights of all the wives.
So how does that work? The study guide says there are rules for a husband who wants to marry another wife.
Yeah, the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act says he has to go to court and ask permission. And the court looks at a bunch of things before they say yes. Can he support all the wives and families? Do his other wives agree? Is it fair to everyone?
So it's not like he could just decide to marry someone else. There's a process.
Yeah, the court wants to prevent anyone from being treated unfairly. And the study guide goes into how property and inheritance work in these marriages. It can be really complicated with multiple spouses and blended families.
Definitely sounds like you need expert help to understand all the laws around polygamy and customary marriages.
Definitely. You need to understand both the culture and the laws to make sure everyone's rights are protected. Let's talk about something else that's changing a lot in family law. The rights of unmarried fathers. They didn't always have the same rights as married fathers, but things are getting better.
That's good. The study guide talks about how unmarried fathers are getting more rights and a bigger role in their kids' lives. What are some of the changes?
One big change is the Children's Act. It says both parents should be involved in raising a child whether they're married or not. It gives unmarried fathers who are committed to their kids a chance to have full parental rights and responsibilities.
So being a father isn't just about biology, it's about being involved in caring for your child.
Exactly. The study guide explains how an unmarried father can get parental rights. One way is to make an agreement with the mother. It's called a Parental Responsibilities and Rights Agreement. It says what each parent will do for the child, things like care, contact, maintenance, making decisions.
So like a co-parenting agreement, even though they're not married.
Yeah, it makes things clear and official. They have to register it with the family advocate, though, to make it legal. And if the parents can't agree, the father can ask the court to give him parental rights.
So what does the court look at when deciding?
Again, it's all about what's best for the child. They look at his relationship with the child, how much he wants to be involved, if he can provide for the child, and whether giving him rights is good for the child.
It sounds like the law is changing to recognize that families can look different. And the most important thing is that kids have love and support.
Yeah, for sure. The law is catching up to how society is changing and trying to make sure kids are protected no matter what. Now let's talk about something serious that unfortunately happens in a lot of families. Domestic violence. The study guide says it's important to understand the laws about domestic violence and how victims are protected.
It's a hard topic, but important to talk about. Domestic violence hurts a lot of people. How does the law define domestic violence?
The Domestic Violence Act is pretty broad. It covers all sorts of abuse that can happen in a relationship: physical, sexual, emotional, even financial abuse. It's not just hitting, it's also things like threats, controlling behavior, even preventing someone from having their own money.
So abuse can be a lot of things, not just physical.
Right. The study guide gives examples of different types of abuse and what they look like in real life.
So what can victims do? What kind of legal protection is there?
The main thing is a protection order. We talked about those before a little. It's a court order that says the abuser can't do certain things like contact the victim, go near their home or work, or see their kids.
So it's like a shield for the victim.
That's the goal. And the order says what happens if the abuser breaks the rules. They can get in trouble with the law. The study guide explains how to get a protection order, the different types, and what happens if someone violates it.
It's good to know there are ways to keep victims safe and hold abusers accountable. What if the abuse isn't bad enough for a protection order yet? Is there anything to help before it gets to that point?
Yeah, the Domestic Violence Act says it's important to help families early on. There are shelters, counseling, and support groups that can help victims and their families. The study guide even has a list of these resources.
So there's help available even before things get really bad.
Right. It's about stopping the violence before it gets worse, helping victims, and making things safer for everyone.
Domestic violence is a tough issue, but it's good to see that South Africa is trying to do something about it.
Yeah, there's always more to be done, but we have laws to protect people and hopefully help them get out of abusive situations.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, but there's still more. In the last part, we'll talk about some other important things in family law, like adoption, surrogacy, and the legal challenges of new reproductive technologies. And we're back for the last part of our deep dive into South African family law. It's been quite a journey learning about all this.
Yeah, we've covered so much: marriage, divorce, splitting assets, parental rights, even customary marriages and domestic violence.
So much. And, families are always changing. So for this last part, let's look at some areas of family law that are really evolving and changing all the time. The study guide mentions these towards the end. Things like adoption, surrogacy, new reproductive technology.
Right. It's where law and technology and what people believe kind of all come together.
Okay, let's start with adoption. It's a great way to build families and give kids loving homes, but there's a lot of legal stuff involved. The study guide explains the whole process here in South Africa. What are the main things the law focuses on with adoption?
Well, the most important thing is always what's best for the child. That's the top priority. The goal is to find a safe and permanent home for kids who can't be raised by their biological parents, and to protect them during the whole process.
So it's not just about finding any home, it has to be the right home.
Yeah, the study guide talks about how they really check out the people who want to adopt, their background, their personality, their finances. They even visit their homes to make sure it's a safe environment.
So they're thorough. What about the biological parents, though? Do they have any say?
Usually the parents have to agree to the adoption, but the study guide mentions some exceptions.
Oh, right. So when would they not need the parents' consent?
Well, if the parents aren't fit to take care of the child, like if there's abuse or neglect, or if they just can't provide a home because of addiction or being in jail.
So sometimes it's better for the child to have a new family.
It's a tough decision. The study guide talks about how important it is to be fair and make sure someone is speaking up for the child's interests. If the court decides to terminate parental rights, they appoint someone to represent the child.
To make sure the child's needs are heard, even if they're too little to understand what's happening.
Exactly. And once the adoption is final, the new parents have all the same rights and responsibilities as biological parents. They're the legal guardians now.
It's really amazing how families are made through love and commitment, even without a biological connection.
I know, it's so powerful. Adoption shows how much people want to create families. Okay, so let's switch gears to surrogacy. The study guide mentions this too. It's an area where things are changing a lot, and there are some ethical questions.
Surrogacy is definitely a hot topic. Can you explain how it works for people who might not know?
Sure. So a woman carries and gives birth to a baby for someone else who will be the legal parents. In South Africa, only altruistic surrogacy is allowed.
Altruistic.
It means the surrogate mom can't be paid for carrying the baby, only medical expenses and things like that. It's about making sure no one is profiting from someone else's ability to have a baby.
Yeah, so it's about being compassionate and helping people create families, not about making money.
Right. And the study guide talks about how important it is to protect everyone involved: the surrogate mom, the intended parents, and especially the baby.
So what are some of the legal issues with surrogacy?
Well, legally, the surrogate is the mother at first, even if it's not her egg. Then the intended parents become the legal parents through a court order. But it's complicated.
I could see how that could cause problems if the surrogate and intended parents disagree.
Yeah, that's why the agreement they make beforehand is so important. It's like a contract that says what everyone will do and what their rights are.
To avoid surprises and make sure everything is clear from the start.
Exactly. The study guide really recommends getting a lawyer to help with this. It's a complicated area. Okay, let's talk about another thing that's changing family law: really fast assisted reproductive technology.
Art, right? Like IVF and egg and sperm donation. It's really changed how families are made, but the study guide says there are challenges for the law, too.
For sure, technology changes so fast and the law has to catch up. One big issue is figuring out who the parents are legally.
When there are donors and surrogates involved.
Exactly. If it's just the intended parents' own egg and sperm, it's pretty simple. But with donors and surrogates, it gets tricky.
The law has to figure out who the real parents are and make sure the child's rights are protected.
And that the people who wanted the child are the legal parents. The study guide explains how the law handles all these situations, always with the child's best interests in mind. Another big issue is consent.
Like making sure everyone is okay with what's happening.
Yeah, everyone involved: the donors, the intended parents, even the child later on when they're old enough. Everyone has to agree to it freely.
Because it's a big deal, emotionally, legally, medically.
Absolutely. And the study guide talks about the ethics of it all. Like, should donors be anonymous? Can they contact the child later? Should the child know who their donor is?
It seems like art raises a lot of big questions for society to think about.
It does, but it's also given so many people a chance to have families that they wouldn't have had otherwise. It's a really interesting area of law that keeps changing, and we need to keep talking about it to find the best solutions.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into South African family law. We covered a lot from the basics to some really complex stuff. It's clear that this area of law is always changing as families change and relationships become more complicated.
And hopefully this deep dive helped make sense of it all.
And if you're dealing with any of these issues in your own family, talking to a lawyer is always a good idea. They can help you understand the law and protect your rights and your loved ones. South African family law is all about being fair and compassionate, especially towards the people who need the most protection, our children.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.